welcome to Triumphant Radio. I'm your host, Kody Morey, and today we're going to be talking about evolution science versus Bible science. And why? Why are we going to be talking about that? Well, because on the last episode, we sort of ended it with some of the quote-unquote undeniable proofs of evolutionary science. So now that we've sort of looked at that aspect, I want to actually look at some of the other evolutionary science and how it sort of stacks up with Bible science. And I want us to keep in mind the warning, and regardless of whether you're a creationist, an evolutionist, a skeptic, an agnostic, or whatever, it'd be good to keep this passage into consideration regardless. It's from Romans chapter 1, verse 20 to 22, and I just want you to keep this in mind. Okay. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations. And their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. So, interesting point there that the Apostle Paul is making is that the God of nature, or in nature, in science, in other words, you can clearly see intelligent design at work. Okay? However, as man became corrupted, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, and they weren't thankful, but they became vain in their imagination. So they became vain. They rejected it. They rejected the truth before their very eyes, if you will. And their hearts became darkened. Okay, so when your heart is darkened, then obviously you don't have light. And in the Bible, light is knowledge, understanding, and knowledge specifically and understanding of God. So their foolish heart was darkened. And interesting, the common plea of the agnostic, of the evolutionist, and this really is something that's very prominent. You see this with Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking and others. They all believe themselves to be very wise, intelligent individuals. And what do they usually do? They point the finger at somebody who has faith and believes, and they say, oh, that person has, Christianity is a crutch, or whatever you hear. They'll say different things. I've mentioned before, I've seen that poster where it says, "You pray for me, and I'll think for you," as if people who pray don't think. So that's why we're going to go into this. We're going to be thinking individuals here, and really just look at some of the facts when it comes to evolution science versus Bible science. But keep that in mind. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. So if the Bible's correct, then the individuals that are professing to be wise would actually be the fools many times. I wouldn't say every time, but as a general rule of thumb. Of course, there's always exceptions. In the last episode, we talked about Ernst Haeckel and his ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which was deemed to be a hoax. He promulgated it in 1860. And even, I have a quote here from the evolutionist Stephen Gould. Okay, so this is an evolutionist speaking on Haeckel's false science that he put forth, where essentially he showed that falsely showed that the embryos of chickens, pigs, and humans all go through like their evolutionary cycles. Also fish. Okay, they all go through their evolutionary cycles to get to where they are at. In the embryonic stages, essentially. This is what Gould said. Haeckel's forceful, eminently comprehensible, if not always accurate, book, appearing in all major languages, and surety exerted more influence than the works of any other scientist, including Darwin, in convincing people throughout the world about the validity of evolution. Haeckel had exaggerated the similarities by ideations and omissions. Okay, so he exaggerated them, he made them look more similar than they actually looked, and then he omitted the parts that didn't look the same also. So essentially he changed the drawings themselves of what the embryos looked like. Continuing with the quote, he also, in some cases, in a procedure that can only be called fraudulent, simply copied the same figure over and over again. Haeckel's drawing never fooled expert embryologists who recognized his fudgings right from the start. Haeckel's drawings, despite their noticed inaccuracies, entered into the most impenetrable and permanent of all quasi-scientific literatures, standard student textbooks of biology. Interesting. Evolutionist Stephen Gould says that quasi-scientific literature is standard student textbooks of biology. And I read a quote from a biology textbook last week. Interesting. Once ensconced in textbooks, misinformation becomes cocooned and effectively permanent because textbooks are copied from previous texts. We do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks. He said that in March 2000 in Natural History. So there you have it right there. An evolutionist upset with Ernst Haeckel for producing false evidence, false science, essentially, false science. And he has every right to it because false science is, and he's saying it's still entrenched in the modern textbooks of today, and you can still find them in the textbooks today. You can find the embryology argument of evolution within there. It's all forgery. It's a fake. It's a lie. It's not true. But this is the science of evolution. And even the evolutionists themselves, the honest ones, think that this is shameful for the scientific world. All right, another example. Piltdown Man. In 1912, the remains of the earliest Englishmen were found in a gravel pit by amateur archaeologist Charles Darwin and the Jesuit priest, remember this name, Pierre Teilhard Deschardins. Now, Deschardins or Deschardins, it depends on how you pronounce it, but he's also known as the father of New Age, okay, or father of the New Age movement, okay, because he wrote a lot of pantheistic sort of strange things. Now, he's a Jesuit priest in the Catholic Church. Keep that in mind also. We'll come to that at a later time, but for right now, both of these amateur archaeologists were involved in finding in a gravel pit, discovering in a gravel pit, the remains of what they called the so-called earliest Englishmen in 1912. Okay? About 40 years later, in 1953, South African anatomist Joseph Weiner proved that it was a hoax. Turns out the human skull and orangutan jawbone were actually stained brown and placed in the gravel pit. Now, what's really interesting about this is that during that period of time before it was proven to be a hoax, this was heralded as absolute, undeniable proof for evolution. In fact, there were over 500 dissertations that were written on this very subject, the Piltdown Man, as proof of human ape-like beginnings. Isn't that interesting? In an article in The Conversation, September 29th, 2016, entitled A New Twist to the Whodunit in Science's Famous Piltdown Man Hoax, they stated this: almost immediately after Piltdown announcement, Teilhard, that's Deschardin, wrote to his Jesuit friend Felix Pelletier, with whom he had collected fossils in Sussex. He said this: "We must do nothing. We must wait for the criticisms that will follow. Marcellin Boule will not be taken in, especially because the finds are English." Now, Marcellin Boule, for those of you who don't know, he was an eminent French prehistorian. That's what The Conversation says. That's what the article says about him. Continuing with the quote, this is from The Conversation, not Deschardin anymore. "This convinced me. Teilhard knew from the very beginning that Piltdown Man was not genuine. I am not, as I should point out, the first to suspect him. Distinguished scientists like Louis Leakey and Stephen Jay Gould, again, have previously suggested that Teilhard was involved in the Piltdown case. Gould was strongly suspicious about Teilhard because the hinge between the jaw and the skull, known anatomically as the condyle, was broken. In 1920, Teilhard had stated that the Piltdown mandible might have been deliberately broken." Okay? So, what you have here is you have individuals in the scientific world, and they're bringing false evidence to the floor to prove evolution. You have individuals coming onto the public world stage and publishing false science in order to prove evolution. That's what you have going on. That's what you have going on. And this goes on right up into our very day. And why, if evolution is true, why would it need, if it's true, then it should prove itself. Why would we need the hoaxes? And these aren't small these aren't like a small side issue at some point. These are major movements in the scientific world that rocked the scientific world and really the theological world at the same time, because it was heralded as undeniable proof of evolution. You know, back in the colonies, there were many of the states had clauses within their personal constitutions of the state that stated that an atheist could not be a witness in court, because the fact that they didn't have the fear of God before them meant that they were someone who is probably untrustworthy. Well, what are we seeing in the world? These are scientists. These are supposed to be our best and brightest, our most trusted. But what are they doing? They're lying to us to push what upon us? Evolution. But it's interestingly enough, the Bible talks about this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 10 through 12. It says, "With all deceivableness of unrighteousness in them that perish, because they received not the love of the truth, that they might be saved. And for this cause God shall send them strong delusion, that they should believe a lie, that they all might be damned who believed not the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness." So, really interesting quote there from the Bible. It says, the people that receive not the love of the truth, in other words, they don't want the truth, God sends them strong delusion that they should believe the lie. And then what happens? The reason why the reason why people want to believe the lie instead is because they had pleasure in unrighteousness. That's what the Bible says, which is interesting. That's the reason why. But that they should believe the lie. And in other words, sort of become like a self-fulfilling prophecy, where because you believe something so much that you begin to actually see evidence of it where evidence does not actually exist. And you could see this in the psychological world. That's actually what it's called, self-fulfilling prophecy. And it happens a lot of times in sociology, and we don't even know we're doing it. I'll give you an example. If you before you meet somebody, let's say that you're going to meet this new coworker, and it's a male, older male, in his 60s, 70s, or something like that. Let's call him Frank. And you find out from the other colleagues before you actually meet him that Frank, he hates pretty much everybody. He doesn't like to talk to anybody. They think he's raped a couple kids. His wife left him because he took all her money or something like that. And you get all these negative, really, really negative, you don't know if they're true or not, but they're all these negative information about Frank. All right, now, let's say, just for argument's sake, that everything they heard about him was not true. Okay? Now, when they meet, the person might be, especially because of some of the things mentioned, they might be very distant, very cold toward Frank. And then you might find that as you're distant and cold towards Frank, that Frank is also distant and cold towards you. That would be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you've treated Frank in the way that you thought he was, even though he wasn't, he has become what you thought he was. Does that make sense? It's kind of interesting how that works. But anyways, we have a couple more to go through. Nebraska man was discovered, quote unquote, in 1922. This is what they discovered, folks. A tooth was discovered in Nebraska in 1922. And after that, pictures of a human ape specimen started to appear in like the scientific journals of the time. However, in 1926, the rest of the skeleton was discovered, which revealed that one tooth, who they built an entire body from, belonged to an extinct wild pig. Now, whether it's an accident or not, how do you base an entire specimen on a tooth? How would you know? And the answer you're going to hear from a lot of people is, oh, it's just this real, in-depth scientific thing that you just can't understand. Really? If they found it to be a wild pig, wouldn't that call into question the evolutionist scholarly ability to rightly discern those things? If a tooth was in fact found and they tried to build a missing link body out of it, which they made drawings, okay? They tried to build a missing link tooth body from a tooth, and they find out that tooth actually belonged to a pig. That's the type of science that you get from this side. That's the type of science. Folks, that's not science. That's a lie. We got to call it what it is. That's a blatant lie. And during the Scopes monkey trial, right around that time and before, which the individual talking about whether evolution should be taught in the schools or not was William Jennings Bryan. He actually ran for president at one point. And Dr. Henry Fairfield Osborne, head of the Department of Paleontology at New York's American Museum of Natural History, he wrote this to William Jennings Bryan. He stated, The earth spoke to Brian from his own state of Nebraska. The Hesperopithecus tooth is like the still small voice. Its sound is by no means easy to hear. This little tooth speaks volumes of truth, and that it affords evidence of man's descent from the ape. See, they find this tooth, and then that's undeniable scientific fact that man descended from apes. And that's what they push. But was it true? No. In a very short amount of time, it was found that it wasn't. For the sake of time, we're not going to go into too many more. I want to get into the Bible science side of it, but I do want to point out a couple other hoaxes that we'll just mention. You had the Java Man in 1891, the Archaeoraptor in 1999, where National Geographic, to their own shame, National Geographic magazine, November 1999 issue, talked about a turkey-sized animal is a true missing link in the complex chain that connects dinosaurs to birds that could actually fly. Found out that was a hoax. The Stone Age artifacts discovered by Shinichi Fujimura from 1981 to 2000, where he dated most of his fossils from 40,000 to 600,000 years old. However, November 5th, 2000, Mainichi Shimbun newspaper published pictures of Fujimura digging holes and burying artifacts, which of course he later discovered. Up into right around 2004, 2005 time frame. Rainer Proch von Zietzen, anthropologist at Frankfurt University, was forced to resign by the university after it was discovered that he falsified dates of Stone Age fossils, including Hanhofersund man, which supposedly linked humans to Neanderthals. So, many times, and so far every time that there's been a undeniable proof of evolution, it has been found to be a lie, the work of misleading, intentionally misleading so-called scientists. Many times these people have been sued. Many a times the evidence has been built on very little to go off of to begin with, such as the tooth that we mentioned. This is the modus operandi that you find in the evolutionary scientific world. And many of this stuff, this is what's so sad, many of this stuff is still in the textbooks. That's why Stephen Gould, he said that it's like the permanent holding house of misinformation is the student biology textbook. Said right from the mouth of an evolutionist. However, on the other hand, we have Bible science. And there's really quite a lot to go through. But we'll just do a small amount here for the sake of time. But Leviticus chapter 17 verse 11 states this: "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that maketh an atonement for the soul." Bloodletting was considered a scientific, it was a treatment. It was a treatment plan really throughout the 1800s. Throughout the 1800s. In fact, it is believed that George Washington died because of bloodletting. Essentially, he got a cold and a swollen throat, and the doctors took him in and they just started bleeding him, bloodletting him, bleeding out all of his blood. It's assumed that about 40% of his blood was bled from him, and then he died from cardiac arrest and other things that are associated with the loss of blood, the low blood pressure and everything else. And it was said in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, that the life of the flesh is in the blood. Therefore, if you're sick, what you need many times is blood transfusion, some way to get more healthy red blood cells in your body, not taking the blood out. That's the exact opposite of what you need. Many times. There's always an exception, but many times. Also, our second one that we're going to look at today is Job chapter 26, verse 7. It says this: He stretches out the north over the empty place, and hangeth the earth upon nothing. He hangeth the earth upon nothing. He said that in the Old Testament. When that book was written, that book is believed to be written by Moses. Okay? It's not one of the books of Moses when they refer to the books of Moses, but it's believed to be written by him. And it says that he hangeth the earth upon nothing. Isaac Newton, he discovered gravity in 1687. 1687. And that's when scientists began to understand that the Earth's gravitational pull, along with the sun's gravitational pull, is actually what keeps the Earth in orbit, literally hung upon nothing, as Job chapter 26, verse 7 stated. Isn't that amazing? I mean, thousands and thousands of years before Isaac Newton, who was an avid Christian, actually, in fact, he wrote more about the Bible and prophecy than he did about science. I don't know if everyone here knows that, but that is a fact. He was a very religious individual. And interesting, 1687, that's when gravitational pull is understood, and that's when it's understood that the Earth is held in orbit through gravity. Gravity, of course, is a force which we cannot see. As it were, hanging on nothing is the Earth. Now, in mental health and cheerfulness or positivity, Proverbs chapter 14, verse 30 says this: A sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy is the rottenness of the bones. So in other words, a happy heart or sound heart or positivity is the life of the flesh, but envy or sin or jealousy is the rottenness of the bones. I wonder if one day we will find that, if we'll ever be able to see, or maybe something already exists, that there is some type of bone marrow rot or some type of plasma rot that goes on in your bones when you are a sinful person. I wonder if they'd find something like that in the future. That'd be interesting to stay tuned for. But Proverbs chapter 17 verses 22 says this: A merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken heart drieth the bones. Now, Johns Hopkins has found that people with a family history of cardiovascular disease who also possess a positive outlook are 1/3 less likely to suffer a heart attack or other cardiovascular event within 5 to 25 years of those with a more negative outlook. So there's actually, in a way, clinical studies to show that people, and you see this all the time, people who are positive and who are, very optimistic about things, they rarely get sick. And if they get sick, they don't usually let it take over them. But if you know somebody who's negative, there are many times they're going through bouts of depression, or they're sick and they get very sick for a couple days or so on, and then they're able to come back. But it seems like the sickness just hangs on to people with more of a negative attitude longer than it does with people with a positive. And again, that's stated in Solomon's day in Proverbs. In Solomon's day, about 3,000 years ago, just about 3,000 years ago. Another one from Job. Job chapter 38, verse 16, it says, hast thou entered into the springs of the sea, or hast thou walked in the search of the depth? Springs of the sea. You know that in the ocean there are actual springs of water jetting up high thermo water, high temperature water rather. There's springs in the bottom of the sea. Guess when they were discovered? 1970s. 1970s they were discovered. Isn't that amazing? A few others. The wind patterns of the earth, the actual wind patterns of the earth, the clockwise manner of the wind patterns of the earth, are found in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 6. Cleaning hands should be done with running water. Not stagnant water. It should be running water, according to Leviticus chapter 15, verse 11, which even in the 1800s they didn't really understand yet. The air has weight. Job chapter 28, verse 25. And there are many more. The Eden diet is, along with the vegetables that were added later after the fall of man, are the optimum, really, health regimen for human beings. They thrive on the natural foods. Absolutely thrive off them. And that's what we see in a lot of these new health things that are coming out, like Forks Over Knives, What the Health, and others. You know, they talk about health issues, and really, as far as Dr. Campbell himself, what he recommends is what they call whole foods plant-based diet, which is the Eden diet. It really means no processed foods, no preservatives, no fast foods, and no meat. And it's right there in the Bible, in the Eden diet. Not that God doesn't allow meat at a later time, he did. But at the times we're living in now, it seems that all the meat that we find seems to be infected in one way or another, either with steroids or with antibiotics. It's just not natural. It's not the same as it was before. So perhaps a lot of the answers to the health problems that people have nowadays is going back and looking at the Eden diet, the diet that God chose for man. And as I suspect, as we continue through the years, that we will find that every time the Bible, because the Bible is really about salvation, it's about knowing God, it's about the gospel truth. But in those side notes where it mentions scientific principles, I suspect in the next years that those will be proven true over and over again in different ways. Well, that's going to do it for our show today. I hope this was a blessing to you. If not, I hope it was at least interesting information. To summarize, we just basically, what we've shown is that the Bible, every time it mentions a scientific principle, it is found to be accurate. Whereas evolution, and really trusting in the, as they say, the arm of flesh, man's wisdom, professing themselves to be wise, they've been very foolish when it comes to Ernst Haeckel, or Nebraska man, or Java man, or some of these other Stone Age fossils that have been falsified. Many times evolution is pushing forth false evidence, whereas the Bible, every time, has been proven to be correct science. So which one should we trust? I cast my lot with the Bible. Thanks for listening to the show.